November 6th, 1860. This week, the United States elects a new president and begins the long journey through the great American tragedy of the Civil War. How did we get here, and how will this election change the course of American history? I'm Zach Hilligoss, and this is Civil War Weekly. Hey, thanks for tuning into this labor of love that I'm calling Civil War Weekly. My goal is to follow the course of the American Civil War week by week, starting with the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860. What you're going to hear is the results of hours and hours and days and years of just hobby study. I became interested in the American Civil War when I was very young. My father took my brother and I to go visit some of the more well-known battlefields on the East Coast, namely Gettysburg and Antietam, and that just kind of turned into a lifelong interest in the subject matter. So this is definitely a labor of love. This is something that I'm doing in my free time as it is now, and we'll see if anybody's interested in listening to it. So without further ado, let's get into what happens the first week, starting on November 6th. So in the election of 1860, American voters would be casting ballots between 4 different political parties and presidential candidates. Now, in the modern age where we've grown used to this 2-party system that we've fallen into, this may seem odd to us. And honestly, a lot of what we will be talking about in the next few years will be odd to us in our modern lens. But part of my goal is to try to get us to put ourselves into the shoes of the average American in 1860 and what life would have seemed like to them and what perspectives they would have been bringing into what would come to be the American Civil War. So to that end, let's take a minute before we actually talk about the election to talk about what brought us to this point in time. So America in 1860 was a larger place than it is today. Obviously I'm not talking about land or population, but in perceived distance. What I mean is the states in 1860, they felt much farther away from each other than they do today. For example, I could have bought an airplane ticket this morning here in Birmingham, Alabama, and flown to the other side of the country and had dinner in California. If something important happens in my life and I want to give that news to my friends or family, I pick up a phone, I can tell them immediately, I can post my updates on social media, and everybody who I want to share that information with can know almost immediately. And this means culturally, America is bound together a lot more tightly than it ever has been before. Not much differentiates an American living in one part of the country to one living in another. You can pretty well show up somewhere in America and make your way around, and you're not going to feel like you're in a foreign country. In 1860, the majority of Americans would never leave the county they were born in, let alone go to a different state. So a boy who grew up in Alabama would only ever hear stories about what life was like in New York. Or a person living in a homestead in Ohio and a girl in Maine would ever dream about the bustle of a city like New Orleans or what a plantation in Mississippi looked like. To a farmer in Kansas, Charleston might as well have been China. And to kind of hammer this point home, when George Washington was elected to the presidency, he had never visited any part of the country south of Virginia. Americans at this time, by and large, just hung around where they grew up. They helped their neighbors on their farms. They bought things from a friend's shop. They frequented local towns. And mostly, they were uninterested in what was going on in other parts of the country unless it had a direct effect on them. Roads in most places were dirt, they were hard to navigate, and a trip to the closest city could be a massive undertaking depending where you were from. So because of all of this kind of physical and cultural isolation, America developed little cultural pockets of identity. And I really think this is the hardest thing for a modern person to grasp when we're talking about the motivations of men in early America. See, even today we can use the word state to be talking about a country in the world. If I say the state of Germany or the state of Britain, people will understand that I'm talking about the nation states of Germany or Britain. And in the 1860s and in early America, the states that joined together for the Revolutionary War were autonomous states. They were basically nation states that had taken their place on the world stage, and they had bound together to gain their independence. And this is why the country was called the United States of America. They were literally talking about a bunch of individual nations that had decided to join together. The original 13 colonies were all individual charters that had decided to work together for their mutual benefit. And that's how the Constitution was laid out. They made sure that the government couldn't take away their autonomy as states like small individual nations. And this gave rise to a sort of local patriotism that isn't nearly as prevalent today. You have sort of regional patriotism, right? Like you have people very proud of being from the Midwest or the West Coast, right? Like you have kind of this regional identity, but it's not state specific like it used to be. So back in 1860, it wasn't unusual for you to have people talk about their loyalty as being to the state that they lived in, right? They felt loyal to their neighbors because these are the people that they came into contact day after day, right? This is my family. These are my people. I'm a Virginian. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a Georgian, right? Like these are my people. And you wouldn't have that same type of loyalty to somebody, say, on the other side of the country, right? There was a lot of questioning about, like, why should I be worried about the New Yorkers? I'm worried about the Georgians. I live in Georgia, right? Same thing. People in New York City are like, well, I don't care about what's happening in Georgia. I'm a New Yorker. I care about the New Yorkers. And the America that we see in 1860 was also a land of different economic opportunities, too. Growing literacy all across the nation was giving rise to industrial innovation at a rate that was far outpacing European counterparts. And the rise of the Industrial Revolution had increased productive output exponentially. However, the Industrial Revolution in America moved the workforce from selling their own products, like artisans, trained workmen, to selling their labor. And factory work, especially in the northeast of the country, was gobbling up untrained workforce, including many new immigrants in urban hubs like New York and Boston. Now, this wasn't universally seen as a step in the right direction, and many held to what would be called the Republican ideal that independence is what made you free, including independence from a boss that you had to depend on for your wages, right? You lived off of your own labors, right? You're the product of your own work. That's what made you free. Selling your time to somebody else in a factory was seen as anti-Republican. However, in another example of how lofty ideals are often tarnished by the grime of real life, laborers continued entering the factories and production continued to increase. But despite all the cultural and economic things that were happening in the United States, perhaps the most pressing issue was developing politically. America, over the course of the few decades leading up to 1860, was dealing with an intensifying political split. As usual, the factions were vying to solidify their own party's political power over the federal government. And this has been happening since the revolution ended, really. But now the key issue of this power was slavery. See, slavery was a wealth-generating mechanism of the South. Many wealthy and important families of the antebellum South owned slaves going all the way back to the American Revolution. Their plantations and the boom of cotton prices in Europe meant that it was in their best interest to ensure that slavery continued to exist, and thus ensure their way of life would continue. Naturally, this meant that they supported politicians, or they themselves were politicians that would work to keep slavery in existence. These politicians, by and large, belonged to what we will be referring to as the Democratic Party now. Now, slavery was not a wealth-generating machine in the North like it was in the South. In the North, farms were much smaller, cotton didn't seem to like the cold, and so the North instead turned to industry rather than cash crop agriculture to generate its wealth. This made slavery unnecessary for the North as there were no large cash crop plantations to harvest, and that, along with its more Puritan religious roots, meant that they supported, by and large, a more conservative Whig party. That's WHIG. But they did have hotspots of Democratic support in some of the larger cities, which had economic ties to the cash crops in the South. Although the Whig Party was holding a firm base in your more traditional North, in the recent elections, a new Republican Party was gaining steam, especially in the Midwest. But this Republican Party was deemed more of a radical group. It was home to a lot of outright abolitionists in the country. And abolition was not a popular idea in America in 1860, so this was kind of like a fringe political group. Now, it could be said that the United States was in a political war long before it found itself in an actual civil war. In the late 1840s, with the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, the United States had found itself with a vast amount of Western territory. And every politician knew that eventually this territory would be formed into states. And new states means new representatives, new congressmen, new senators. And what's the most important question for every politician and every political party's mind? It's, how can we make sure that these new states are voting for our party? And because of the temperature that the United States found itself in, the driving force behind those parties had to be slavery. If these new territories could become states with slavery-driven agriculture as their wealth generator, they would elect Democrats who would protect it. From there, they would have more votes in Washington to adopt more pro-slavery policies, and that would allow for more territories to allow slavery, which would result in more politicians, more votes, more policies, more politicians, more votes, more policies. And eventually the Democrats would be unchallenged in the federal government, right? Now, the Whigs, the Free Soil Democrats, and the Republicans were not oblivious to this danger, so they made it their business to check slavery's expansion at every turn. Countless compromises, backroom deals, we'll let this territory have slavery, but only if this one doesn't, right? That kind of thing. Each party was trying to expand its voting bloc westward as fast as they could in order to keep the delicate balance of power in Washington from tipping too far one way or the other. Eventually, something called the Missouri Compromise was adopted. This allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine in the Northeast to enter as a free state, keeping that delicate balance intact. But as a caveat, it prohibited slavery in any territory north of the 36.5 parallel. Now, if you're like me and you don't know where the 36.5 parallel is right off the top of your head, it's basically the top sliver of Texas. The top of Texas's panhandle. So you can draw a line from the top of Texas's panhandle straight west to where California today. And based on the Missouri Compromise, slavery wasn't going to be permitted anywhere north of that line. Now, this political war grew fangs, however, in 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically tore that compromise to pieces. This act allowed Kansas and Nebraska to become states with or without slavery, depending on what the people there decided. Now, Republicans, who had been gaining steam up until this point, saw this as a Democratic attempt to subvert the Missouri Compromise and expand slavery where it had already been outlawed. And when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, political settlers from both sides of the political spectrum poured into those territories, hoping to settle enough like-minded people to ratify a state constitution that aligned with their political association. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery militias, like militaries, literally killed each other to determine whether or not Kansas would enter as a slave state or a free state. In 1857, Democrat James Buchanan was elected president, with Democrats holding 55% of the House and 62% of the Senate. During his tenure, Kansas became a veritable battlefield. The Republican Party was growing in strength after having set itself up as the party to oppose all attempts to expand slavery westward. So it kind of became a rallying flag for all of the other parties, right? Your Free Soil Democrats, your old Whig Party members, right? The Republican Party kind of held up this banner of like, hey, listen, we are going to stop the Democratic slave pushing westward. So if you're on board with that, just come and settle up with us. And because of that, they became the largest minority party in the United States by the time that President Buchanan took office. And they could feel their support kind of rising with each controversy that Buchanan and the Democrats created in this aspect. And the Democrats saw them as a direct threat to the expansion of their political power. But not only that, just a direct threat to the institution of slavery as well. Because remember, not too long ago, the Republican Party was seen as a radical party, right? This was the abolitionist party, right? Nobody ever took them seriously because, okay, well, these are just the crazies, right? But now the Democrats are looking across the aisle and they're like, oh, wow, this is now the largest minority party in the United States, and they start kind of sweating. So all the way through Buchanan's presidency, up to 1860, the political war continued to rage. And Buchanan wasn't doing anything to stop that. He was adding more ammunition to it more than anything by supporting a pro-slavery state constitution for Kansas. And his presidency was filled with so much controversy that at one point, New England abolitionists were clamoring for secession from the Union. Imagine that. Like, during Buchanan's presidency, Massachusetts was toying with the idea of breaking away from the Union. During the presidency, a senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, gave a 2-day-long speech denouncing pro-slavery Missourians, calling them, quote, hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. They just don't make insults like they used to. After this speech, Sumner was beaten in the middle of the Senate chamber by a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks. I just want the gravity of that statement to sink in. This was the state of American politics. A senator was actively beaten bloody in the middle of the Senate chamber by another congressman. Preston, who did the beating, told reporters later, I gave him about 30 first-rate stripes. Towards the last, he bellowed like a calf. I wore my cane out completely, but saved the head, which is gold. Following this incident, senators began bringing knives and pistols with them to the chamber. Massachusetts, the state, refused to fill Sumner's seat in the Senate. They left it empty as a silent accusation against the opposition. But Southerners saw it more as a warning to any other senator like Sumner. And then, in Virginia, a man named John Brown, who had been heavily involved in the back-and-forth bushwhacking in Kansas, took over a federal armory intending to start a general uprising to free slaves in the area. This became known later as John Brown's Raid. This raid resulted in a 2-day-long siege before a company of Marines assaulted the arsenal and arrested John Brown, but not before 4 innocent bystanders and 1 Marine were killed, along with a number of John Brown's company. John Brown would be hanged for treason against the state of Virginia. His last words on his scaffold were, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. John Brown's eldest son would say that the beating of Senator Sumner is what led him to murder while in Kansas, saying it caused him to become crazy. So while it's hard for a person living today in America to fully understand, this is the climate of the United States in the election of 1860. President Buchanan had only promised to run for 1 term, which put the Democratic Party in 1860 in a bind for who to nominate for the 1860 election. These were the choices put forward. You had Stephen Douglas, who was a Northerner from Chicago. He was a lawyer, and he had lost in a previous election to James Buchanan. The problem was Douglas had also split with the Democratic Party and Buchanan over the endorsement of the pro-slavery Constitution in Kansas, because Douglas was a firm believer in popular sovereignty. He believed the people of a state should be able to form their own opinions, and that whatever the people in Kansas decided, that was the law. Now, Douglas wanted to run again, but Buchanan was holding a grudge and wouldn't forgive Douglas. So he backed his own Vice President John C. Breckinridge for the Democratic nomination, and this caused a split in the Democratic Party. Most Southern Democrats sided with Breckinridge and Buchanan. While the Democrats were dealing with their divide, the Republican Party was building on its momentum and nominated another lawyer from Illinois, one Abraham Lincoln. Few people would have really imagined the far-reaching effects their votes would have in early November of 1860. November 6th was a Tuesday, a chilly Tuesday in Springfield, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln was having his breakfast before going out into the street alone, where he walked 5 blocks to the Illinois State House, where he had set up a temporary office. He walked in, past the Supreme Court chambers, where he had actually argued cases as a lawyer, and past the library that had aided him in the construction of many of his speeches. He apparently talked very cordially with all of his callers. He was careful not to let the conversations pass much farther than pleasantries. His friends had advised him to, quote, enter into no pledges, make no promises, nor even give any of those kind words which men are apt to interpret into promises. And so Lincoln was careful to do just that. When asked by one man if he was worried about the threat of secession should he win the election, Lincoln replied, they may make a little stir about it before, but if they waited until after the inauguration and for some overt act, they would wait all their lives. Not far away from Springfield, on November 6th, in Galena, Illinois, a retired Mexican-American war veteran working at his family's leather tanning business had all but resigned himself to a Republican victory. He's quoted as saying, the fact is, I think the Democratic Party wants a little purifying, and nothing will do it so effectually as a defeat. The only thing is, I don't like to see a Republican beat the party. He didn't know it yet, but this election would also change the life of this disgraced ex-soldier named Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln himself throughout the day didn't let on to any of his doubts regarding his own election, although he jokingly scolded a group of reporters from New York, saying that he would have preferred that they had stayed home and voted. A vote is a vote, and every vote counts, he said. But he wouldn't stoop so low as to candidate for himself. At that time, anybody who candidated seemed desperate, and that was seen as not befitting the office of the presidency. When a neighbor had asked Lincoln who he had planned to vote for, Lincoln had replied, for Yates. Richard Yates was a Republican candidate for Illinois governor that year. But the neighbor insisted, how do you plan to vote for the presidential question? And Lincoln then replied, well, by ballot. Lincoln was well known for his being light on his feet, right? For his quips. They were always very nice to read. But during the course of the day, the time did come for Lincoln to cast his own ballot. So he exited the State House with a small group of friends. And reporters noted that the dense crowd around the polling station began to shout and would have carried him to the polls but for the interference of those with him. And it was noted that even Democratic supporters acted civilly, raising their hats to him as he passed. Now, once in the polling station, he formally identified himself to the officer in charge, then calmly cut his own name off the ballot, along with any of the electors that were pledged to him, before he deposited a straight Republican ballot. Then, finally, free from the crowd and back in his office, Lincoln took great interest in the developing election results. But he oddly never talked about himself. He was always asking for some district attorneyship results in a county in Illinois, and he always acted like that was far more important than the presidency. And throughout the course of the day, telegrams did start arriving predicting early Republican successes across the North. Although one ominous message did arrive, and it stated that the author, who was a former congressman, hoped that Lincoln would triumph so that his state, South Carolina, quote, would soon be free. So Lincoln spent the rest of the afternoon receiving news about how the election was progressing in the rest of the country. By 9 p.m., Lincoln decided to shorten the distance that he had to travel by placing himself right inside the telegraph office. For a time, the small office was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rapid clicking and restless movements of all of those inside. And for a time, each message was read aloud to the gathering crowd of people, but soon the telegraph operators just decided to hand Lincoln the messages directly. Surprisingly, Lincoln had won the city of Chicago, which was the home of his longtime political rival and now presidential rival, Stephen Douglas, and he'd won it by 2,500 votes. And similar news began to come from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Connecticut. Even news from Maryland and Virginia going to the Democrats and Constitutional Unionist Party, respectively, was taken well by Lincoln, who was pleased that the voting in these strongholds weren't as bad as they could have been. New York, a strong Democratic stronghold in the midst of the New England states, with its massive 35 electoral votes, was still undecided. New York was a linchpin, and if Lincoln could steal that away from Stephen Douglas, the presidency would be practically won. Around midnight, heading into November 7th, Lincoln and his party made their way over to an ice cream parlor where the ladies had set up a spread of refreshments. There, witnesses observed that Lincoln came, quote, as near to being killed with kindness as a man can be. And while there, they continued to receive missives from the telegraph office, and a crowd had followed them to hear. And eventually, the long-awaited message from New York had arrived. Lincoln would indeed win New York and the biggest electoral prize of the night. Instantly, the crowd erupted. Hats flew into the air, church bells were rung, people fell into each other's arms. Lincoln made his way back to the State House, and pacing outside a moment to steel himself before entering, his head was lowered, and underneath the gas lights, reading the final message from New York to himself, which terminated in the words, "We tender you our congratulations upon this magnificent victory." Lincoln, in the early morning hours of November 7th, left all of the revelry of the evening and returned home. And observers noted that he left without a sign of anything unusual happening, although the last words that his friends heard him utter as he left for home were, "God help me, God help me." Lincoln would need all the help he could get. As the morning dawned on November 7th, the attitude down south was a stark contrast to the jubilation of Illinois. In Georgia, the governor Joseph Brown wrote a special message to the state assembly calling for them to hold a special session to discuss the future relationship they would have with the federal government. He's quoted as saying, "If it is ascertained that the black Republicans have triumphed over us, I recommend the call of a convention of the people of the state at an early day. I recommend the sum of $1 million be immediately appropriated as a military fund for the ensuing year." In Charleston, South Carolina, the state palmetto flag was ominously raised over the Capitol building. Hordes of citizens in Charleston huddled around news boards, and one federal judge in the city named Andrew McGrath very publicly resigned, saying, "The temple of justice raised under the Constitution of the United States is now closed," before he removed his robes and exited his courtroom. In Richmond, the local paper, the Richmond Whig, wrote that the election of Lincoln was, quote, "undoubtedly the greatest evil that has ever befallen this country, but the mischief is done, and the only relief for the American people is to shorten sail, send down the topmasts, and prepare for a hurricane." The next morning, the Charleston Mercury would run an article which read, "The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated." Charleston was very much buzzing, and this would not go unnoticed by the commander of the nearby federal fort, Fort Moultrie. His name was John Gardner. In the past months leading up to the election, he had time and time again requested that his post be better supplied and reinforced with the current head of the War Department, whose name was John B. Floyd. Floyd, from Virginia, had been using his post to actually weaken forts around Charleston as much as possible, sending no food and only a token force of course, Southern sympathizers to reinforce Gardner at Fort Moultrie. But Gardner had decided to take the initiative, so he sent an order to the ordnance officer of the federal arsenal in Charleston to remove all of its small arms and required accessories from the arsenal and move those to the fort, for what he called the better protection of the property in view of the excitement now existing in this city and state. Now, unfortunately, news of this order became public knowledge in Charleston, and the citizens of Charleston incited their militia to block the movement of the guns from the arsenal. Now, Gardner, having less than 100 men and relying on the city for his food, had very little to say in the matter. So the guns stayed where they were. In Washington, still President Buchanan, on November 9th, called his cabinet together. He wanted to ask their opinions about the threats of secession that were being made in the southern states. Buchanan had it in his mind to call for a general convention of the states, which is an act in the Constitution that could be used for setting up amendments to the Constitution. but Buchanan had it in his mind to use it as a platform to get all the states to the negotiating table together. His Secretary of the Navy was the only member to back Buchanan's idea. Every other member of the cabinet had their own ideas for how to handle the threat of secession that was coming from the South. The Secretary of State, Lewis Cass from Michigan, and the Attorney General, named Jeremiah Black from Pennsylvania, both condemned secession, and they advocated for the use of force against those supporting it, especially in Charleston. The Secretary of the Treasury, Howell Cobb of Georgia, and the Secretary of the Interior, Jacob Thompson of Mississippi, thought that secession was a legal option any state possessed, and that any show of force would only push more states into secession themselves. Surprisingly, Secretary of War John B. Floyd was against secession, but not because he thought it was illegal, it was because he thought it was unnecessary, as he didn't believe Lincoln's administration would even last that long. And by now, a day or so removed from the election itself, newspapers across the country started voicing their own opinions about the legality of secession. Could states that voluntarily joined a union together leave the union whenever they wanted to? I mean, this had been debated for the last 70 years. Some in the North were of the mind that letting their Southern brothers leave would be good riddance, and they encouraged it. The New York Tribune wrote an article that said, quote, "We hope to never live in a republic where one section is pinned to the other by bayonets." But by the end of the week, James Buchanan is no closer to a solution, and more than anything seems eager to leave the office of the presidency as soon as possible. The day after Buchanan would meet with his cabinet, the South Carolina state legislature set up a state convention to meet in Columbia on December 17th to consider secession. And that same day, only 4 days after the election, South Carolina's senator, James Chestnut Jr., quietly resigned from the U.S. Senate. This came as quite a shock since not a single state had seceded from the Union yet. But be that as it may, James Hammond, the other South Carolina senator, resigned the following day. Hammond was more reluctant to leave than Chestnut, and upon arriving to Charleston, he wrote in his diary, quote, "The scenes of the French Revolution are being enacted already. We shall soon have the guillotine at work upon good men." Later, he would confess that if he had to choose between the Union and slavery, he would choose the Union despite himself owning 300 slaves. Lincoln, in the days following his election, had been purposefully quiet. More than once, well-meaning friends had asked him to break his silence to assuage the fears of those now reacting to his election. But Lincoln was adamant that he had nothing to explain to anybody that he had not already addressed. He's quoted as saying, "I could say nothing which has not already been said. To press a repetition upon those who have already refused to listen to me would excite the contempt of good men and encourage bad men to clamor all the more loudly." In Lincoln's mind, it didn't matter what he said. People had already decided if they were going to support him or oppose him. And Lincoln had already said that his political opponents wouldn't see any overt aggression from him, but the states of the Deep South didn't really seem to want to give him the opportunity. The fact that he was part of what was viewed as the radical abolitionist Republican Party was enough for them to already get the thing underway. South Carolina at least seemed like it was going to be forging its own destiny. Whether the rest of the watching country would follow suit is yet to be seen. But that's where we find ourselves at the end of the week. Lincoln, newly president-elect, current president James Buchanan scrambling to figure out what his responsibilities are, and South Carolina already putting a date on the books to discuss leaving the Union. If you've enjoyed this show and you want to drop me a line, you can send email to my newly created civilwarweekly@gmail.com. Like I said, this show is an independent passion project, just run by myself, recorded and edited and everything. So I'd love to hear from you. I really like talking about the subject matter. And if you would, please consider subscribing to the show and leave a rating for me, as that will help me immensely. But thanks for listening, and come back again for more Civil War Weekly.